The cobblestones were merciless. Each one was a small, sharp cruelty pressed against the worn leather of her shoes, a constant reminder of how far she had run and how much farther she had to go. Eleanora's breath came in ragged, shallow bursts, a pathetic rhythm against the cold evening air. The city was a blur of gas lamps smearing yellow light across slick, damp streets. The sounds of carriages and distant shouts, a chaotic symphony that her exhausted mind could no longer pass. She was a ghost, adrift in a world that did not see her. Her flight had been an act of pure animal instinct. When her stepfather, his face florid with ale and desperation, had announced her betrothal to Mr. Croft, a man whose hands were as grasping as his reputation, something inside her had simply snapped. The quiet resignation she had cultivated for years, her only shield against the slow erosion of her spirit, crumbled into dust. She had waited until the house fell into a drunken slumber, packed nothing but a small book of pressed flowers her mother had left her, and slipped out into the night. She had nothing. She was nothing. But she would rather be nothing on her own terms than be owned by a man like Croft. Now, hours later, that desperate courage had curdled into a cold, leaden fear. Hunger was a sharp claw in her belly. Her legs trembled with a fatigue so profound it felt as if her very bones were dissolving. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of her stepfather's men, their faces contorted in pursuit. The world began to tilt, the edges of her vision fraying like old cloth. The smear of gaslight swam, the sounds of the city muted as if she was sinking underwater. She stumbled, her ankle twisting with a sickening protest. One step, another. The effort was monumental. Her body was a foreign thing, a leaden weight she could no longer command. The darkness at the edge of her sight rushed inward, a final, welcoming tide. She didn't feel the impact with the unforgiving ground. She only felt the release. She woke to the scent of lavender and beeswax. It was a clean, gentle fragrance that was so at odds with the grime of her flight that for a moment she believed she was dreaming. The surface beneath her was impossibly soft, a cloud of down and fine linen that seemed to cradle every aching muscle. A low fire crackled in a hearth carved from marble, its warm glow dancing across a ceiling adorned with intricate plasterwork. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This was not an infirmary. This was a room of immense wealth and privilege, a world she had no right to occupy. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her head swimming. The simple grey dress she had fled in was gone, replaced by a pristine nightgown of soft, white cotton. Her mud-caked shoes were nowhere to be seen. Her hair, usually a tangled mess, had been brushed and lay loose against her shoulders. Someone had tended to her. Someone had undressed her. A wave of shame and fear washed over her, so potent it stole her breath. A figure shifted in a high-backed chair near the fire, drawing her attention. It was a man, his form silhouetted against the flames. He rose and stepped into the soft lamplight, and the air in her lungs solidified. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark coat and tailored trousers that spoke of a station far beyond her comprehension. His face was a study in harsh, elegant lines. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and startlingly intense, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, unreadable focus. "You are awake," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, a quiet rumble that filled the silent room. It was not a question. Eleonora swallowed, her throat dry and raw. "Where am I?" she managed, her own voice a fragile whisper. "You are in my home," he answered, his gaze unwavering. "You collapsed in the street. My driver nearly ran you down." She flinched at the bluntness of his words. She tried to sit up further, a desperate instinct to cover herself, to shrink away from that piercing gaze. I am sorry, sir. I will leave at once. I did not mean to be a burden." "You will do no such thing," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You are in no condition to go anywhere." He moved to a small table beside her bed, pouring a glass of water from a crystal carafe. He held it out to her. His fingers were long and steady, his hand unadorned by any ring. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to refuse, to run, but her body betrayed her with a desperate thirst. She took the glass, her trembling fingers brushing against his. His skin was cool, a fleeting, electric touch that sent a shiver through her. She drank the water greedily, the cool liquid a balm on her parched throat. When she was done, she dared to look at him again. He had not moved. He was still watching her, his expression a mask of aristocratic indifference. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that was not disinterest. It was a focused, searching quality that made her feel as if he were looking not just at her, but into her. "Why?" she whispered, the glass shaking in her hand. "Why bring me here? A stranger from the street?" He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. "Because I have seen your face before," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into a frozen pond. Eleonora's heart hammered against her ribs. It was impossible. No one knew her in this city. She was a nobody, a runaway. "You are mistaken, sir," she said, her voice shaking. "I have never—" "I am not mistaken," he interrupted, his tone firm. "I do not make mistakes." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw a crack in his formidable armor. It was a flash of something akin to confusion? Or perhaps recognition so profound it bordered on disbelief. "I do not yet know where, but I will." She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he had saved her. But as he stood there, a powerful, enigmatic figure in a room of impossible luxury, he was looking at her like he had been waiting. And that, more than anything else, was the most terrifying thing of all. The days that followed were a strange, disorienting dream. She learned his name from a quiet, efficient housekeeper named Mrs. Gable. He was the Duke of Alveston, a name that meant nothing and everything to her. It explained the grandeur of the house, the silent deference of the staff, and the aura of absolute authority that clung to him like a cloak. But it explained nothing about his interest in her. Eleonora was a guest, a prisoner, a curiosity. She was confined to a suite of rooms, the bedroom she had woken in, and an adjoining sitting room with a small balcony overlooking a vast, manicured garden. She was given clothes, simple but beautifully made dresses of muslin and soft wool, procured by Mrs. Gable with an unnerving efficiency. Meals were brought to her on silver trays. She was treated with a distant, impeccable courtesy that felt more isolating than any cage. The Duke, Alaric, as she learned to call him in the privacy of her own thoughts, was a fleeting but potent presence. He would visit her once a day, usually in the late afternoon. He never stayed long. Their conversations were stilted, formal affairs. He would inquire after her health, ask if she needed anything, and then he would simply stand there, watching her with those piercing grey eyes. He never asked about her past, where she had come from, or why she had been running. He seemed to be waiting for something, but for what, she could not fathom. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the window, staring down at the garden where a lone gardener meticulously pruned a rosebush. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Eleanora's fingers tightened in her lap. She could not bear it any longer. "Your Grace," she began, her voice small but clear. "I do not understand any of this. You must tell me what you want from me. If it is recompense for your kindness, I have nothing to give." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable as ever. "I want nothing from you," he said. "Then why am I here?" she pressed, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "Why keep me in this gilded cage? Am I a prisoner?" A flicker of something, was it irritation, crossed his features. "If you were a prisoner, lady, miss," he corrected himself, a slight hesitation on the title. "You would not be in a suite of rooms furnished with silks and fresh flowers. You are a guest." "Guests are allowed to leave," she countered, her courage surprising her. "Are you so eager to return to the streets from which I found you?" he asked, his voice edged with ice. The question was a sharp, painful reminder of her utter helplessness. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. He knew it, and the knowledge was a weapon he wielded with devastating precision. She looked away, her gaze falling to her hands. Defeated, she whispered, "No." He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, stripped of its previous coldness. "I am merely trying to understand something. Be patient." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving her alone with the silence and her swirling, unanswered questions. The next day, a package was delivered to her room. It was a large, flat box wrapped in brown paper. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a set of drawing pencils, several sticks of charcoal, and a thick portfolio of high-quality sketching paper. There was no note. There was no explanation. Eleanora stared at it, her heart constricting in her chest. It had been years since she had held a proper pencil. Sketching had been her secret solace in her stepfather's house, a small act of creation in a life of stifling emptiness. She would use scraps of wrapping paper and burnt twigs from the hearth, hiding her drawings under a loose floorboard in her room. How could he have known? It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence, a generic gift for a lady of leisure. But it felt too specific, too personal. It felt like he had looked past the ragged girl he had found in the street and seen something she thought she had hidden from the world. She took a pencil in her hand, the smooth, weighted wood a familiar comfort. She opened the portfolio to a clean white page and began to draw. She drew the rosebush in the garden below, her fingers moving with a forgotten fluency. As the image took shape on the page, a small, fragile piece of herself began to mend. The Duke of Alveston was an enigma, his motives a mystery. But with this single, thoughtful gift, he had given her back a part of her own soul. It was a crack in his armor, a glint of warmth in the winter of his demeanor, and it frightened her more than all his coldness had. It hinted at a man far more complex and dangerous than the one she had imagined. Weeks bled into a month. Eleonora settled into a strange rhythm within the grand, silent house. She spent her days reading from the Duke's immense library and sketching in her sitting room. The art supplies were her salvation. She drew everything she could see from her window: the shifting patterns of clouds, the precise geometry of the gardens, the way the evening light caught on the stone balustrade of her balcony. It was a way to reclaim her own sight, to impose order on a world that had been spun into chaos. Her daily encounters with the Duke remained brief and formal, yet a subtle shift had occurred. He no longer just stood and observed her. He would sometimes bring her a book he thought she might enjoy, his choices always unnervingly astute. One evening, he found her sketching and paused behind her chair. Eleonora froze, her pencil hovering over the paper. She felt his presence like a physical weight, a warmth at her back that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. "You have a remarkable talent," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. She felt a blush creep up her neck. No one had ever praised her art. No one had ever truly seen it. "It is just a foolish hobby, Your Grace," she demurred, her voice barely a whisper. "It is not foolish to create beauty where there was none," he responded. He lingered for a moment longer before leaving her room without another word. His simple statement resonated within her long after he was gone. He had not called her work charming or a fine pastime for a lady. He had called it beauty. He had seen its worth. The fragile peace of her cloistered existence was shattered by a woman named Lady Beatrice. Eleonora saw her for the first time from her balcony. A lavish carriage had pulled up to the front entrance, and from it emerged a woman of breathtaking beauty, dressed in the height of fashion. She moved with an air of confident ownership, linking her arm through the Duke's as he escorted her inside. A pang of something sharp and unfamiliar twisted in Eleonora's chest. It was a foolish feeling, one she had no right to, but it was there all the same. The whispers started soon after. She would catch snippets of conversation from the housemaids as they cleared her trays or turned down her bed. They spoke of Lady Beatrice's frequent visits, of society's expectation that she would soon be the next Duchess of Alveston. And they spoke of the mysterious guest hidden away in the West Wing. In their hushed tones, Eleonora heard her own story twisted into something sordid and ugly. She was the Duke's mistress, his commoner plaything, a secret shame to be kept out of sight. The words were like tiny poisoned barbs. She knew she should not care what these people thought, but the shame was a familiar cloak, and it settled heavily on her shoulders. Was that what she was? Was the Duke's strange kindness simply a prelude to a dishonorable proposition? Her fear, which had been lulled by soft linens and quiet afternoons, returned with a vengeance. The Duke must have sensed her withdrawal. He found her one evening, pale and silent, her sketchbook lying untouched on the table. He regarded her for a long moment, his brow furrowed in a rare display of emotion. "You are troubled," he stated. Eleonora could not meet his eyes. "The staff, they talk," she said, her voice strained. "They believe that I am here for an improper reason." His expression hardened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "What my staff believes is of no consequence," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what society gossips about is less than air. You are not here for an improper reason. You are my guest, under my protection. That is the only truth that matters." His fierce defense of her honor should have been reassuring, but it only deepened the mystery. "Protection from what?" she asked, finally looking up at him, her eyes pleading for an answer, for any piece of solid ground in this swirling sea of uncertainty. He held her gaze, and for a heartbeat, she thought he would finally tell her. She saw a conflict in his eyes, a war between his ingrained reticence and some other, more urgent impulse. But the moment passed. The mask of cool indifference slipped back into place. "From the world," he said simply, "which is, as you know, a cruel and unforgiving place." His protection was put to the test sooner than either of them could have anticipated. He was hosting a small, unavoidable charity musicale, and he insisted that Eleonora attend. "It is time you left these rooms," he had said, his tone brokering no argument. "You will remain by my side. No one will dare to trouble you." Dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue silk that Mrs. Gable had produced, Eleonora felt like an impostor. She descended the grand staircase on the Duke's arm, her hand trembling on his sleeve. The ballroom was a glittering spectacle of jewels and silks, the air thick with perfume and the low hum of polite conversation. Every head turned as they entered. A wave of whispers followed them, a hostile tide that made her skin crawl. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the cold, dissecting curiosity. The Duke seemed oblivious, his posture rigid and uncompromising as he guided her through the crowd. He was leading her toward a quiet alcove when a sharp, musical voice cut through the air. "Alaric, darling, I nearly thought you were not coming down." Lady Beatrice glided toward them, her smile a brilliant, predatory slash of red. Her eyes, the color of hard, polished jade, swept over Eleonora with blatant disdain before settling on the Duke. "And you have brought your little charity case," she said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "How very noble of you, Duke, plucking strays from the street." The insult was so direct, so public, that a hush fell over the nearby guests. Eleonora felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She felt the Duke's hand on her arm tighten, a steady, grounding pressure. He turned his head slowly to face Lady Beatrice, his expression utterly devoid of warmth. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the chilling precision of a shard of ice. "This lady," he said, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's, "is Miss Vance. She is my honored guest, and you will afford her the same respect you would afford me. Or you will find the doors to this house, and to every other house of consequence in London, permanently closed to you." The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it was all the more terrifying. Lady Beatrice's perfect smile faltered. A flush of angry colour rose in her cheeks. For a moment, she looked as though she might argue. But she caught the implacable look in the Duke's eyes, and visibly deflated. With a tight, furious nod, she turned and swept away, her pride in tatters. The Duke did not watch her go. He turned his attention back to Eleonora, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and for her ears alone. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He had defended her. In front of everyone, he had defended her without hesitation. It was more than anyone had ever done for her. This cold, unreadable man, this powerful Duke, had shielded her with his own name, his own power. The confusion inside her bloomed into a painful, aching knot. He was not keeping her for some sordid purpose. This was not the act of a man with dishonorable intentions. This was something else entirely. Something deeper, more complex and infinitely more frightening. She had to know the truth. She had to know who she was to him. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Eleonora waited for him in the library. The fire had been banked, and the vast room was filled with shadows. She stood by the hearth, twisting her hands together, her borrowed courage threatening to desert her. When he finally entered, he looked weary, the rigid control he maintained in public having eased slightly. He stopped when he saw her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I could not sleep," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Your Grace, Alaric, I cannot continue like this." He walked over to the decanters on a side table, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. He handed one to her. She took it, the warmth of the glass seeping into her cold fingers. "Tonight," she began, her voice gaining strength, "you defended me. You humiliated a woman of your own class for me. A woman they say you mean to marry." She took a deep breath. "Why? You said you recognized me. You said you had seen my face." "Who do you think I am?" He swirled the brandy in his glass, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid. He seemed to be weighing his words, his secrets. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she thought she would break from the tension. Finally, he looked at her, and the mask was gone. In its place was a profound weariness, a sadness that seemed to seep from the very depths of his soul. "I did not lie to you," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "I have seen your face every day for the last 15 years. Eleonora stared at him, utterly bewildered. "That is impossible. I have never left my stepfather's home until—" "It was not your face precisely," he interrupted, his eyes holding hers. "It was your mother's." The world seemed to stop. Her mother. Her mother was a ghost, a faded memory of lullabies and the scent of rain on summer dust. She had died when Eleonora was just a child. "My mother?" she whispered. "She was a simple countrywoman. You could not have known her." He set his glass down and walked over to a heavy oak desk. He unlocked a small, ornate box and took something out. He came back to her and pressed a cool, heavy object into her palm. It was a miniature portrait, exquisitely painted on ivory and set in a delicate gold frame. She looked down at it, and her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the portrait could have been her twin. She had the same wide-set dark eyes, the same curve of her mouth, the same stubborn set to her chin. It was her own face, but older, imbued with a confidence and serenity she had never known. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. "Her name was Lady Annalise," the Duke said softly. "She was the Marchioness of Clarewood, and she was my mother's dearest friend." Eleonora sank into a nearby chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The portrait felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Marchioness. The word was foreign, nonsensical. "No," she breathed. "My name is Vance. My father was a clerk." "Your father," Alaric continued, his voice gentle but firm, "was Marcus Thorne, the Marquis of Clarewood. After your mother died in a carriage accident, he was consumed by grief. He adored her. He could not bear the world that had taken her from him. So he vanished. He took you, his only child, and disappeared from society. He changed your names, sold what he could, and lived in obscurity, trying to outrun his own heart. The pieces of her past, fragmented and confusing, began to slam into place. Her father's deep, unshakable melancholy, his refusal to ever speak of her mother, the single beautiful locket he'd kept hidden, which her stepfather had sold for drink. The vague, dreamlike memories of a large house with sunlit gardens, so different from the cramped, dark home she had grown up in. It was all real. My own mother, Alaric went on, his voice now laced with a deep, personal pain, was heartbroken by their disappearance. She made me promise, on her deathbed, that if I ever had the power, I would find you. I would find Annalisa's daughter and see that she was safe. He let out a long, shuddering breath. It has been the one private quest of my life. For years I had my men search for any trace of the Marquis. They found nothing. I thought he had taken you to the continent. I never imagined he had simply fallen so far. He looked at her, his grey eyes raw with vulnerability. The night I found you, when you looked up at me in the lamplight, it was like seeing a ghost. It was Annalise's face, young again. I knew. In that instant, I knew my search was over. The truth was a staggering blow, not of betrayal, but of revelation. It reordered her entire universe. She was not Eleanora Vance, a nobody running from a squalid future. She was Lady Eleanora Thorne, the daughter of a marquis and a marchioness. She had a history. She had a name. She looked from the portrait to the Duke's face, the coldness, the distance, the inscrutable demeanor. It all made sense now. It was not indifference. It was the rigid discipline of a man burdened by a lifelong promise. A man who had found what he was looking for, but did not know what to do next. He had been protecting not just a stranger, but a legacy. His kindness, the art supplies, his fierce defense of her. It was all part of a sacred duty he had undertaken for his mother, for her mother. All this time, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. You knew. I suspected, he corrected her gently. I had to be certain. I have spent the last month confirming it, tracing your father's path from a grieving nobleman to a broken man named Thomas Vance. He died 2 years ago, did he not? She nodded, the memory a dull ache. Of a fever. The man you call your stepfather was simply a landlord to whom he owed a great deal of money, Alaric finished. A cruel opportunist. Eleanora looked down at her hands, at the portrait of the mother she barely remembered. She was an heiress. She had a place in the world. She was not powerless. The realization was a slow, dawning light, chasing away the shadows of a lifetime. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the title or the wealth, but for the truth. He had given her back her own story. She finally looked up and met his gaze, her own eyes clear. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time. Not the cold, powerful Duke of Alveston, but Alaric. A man bound by honor, haunted by loss, and desperately lonely. He had fulfilled a promise to his mother, but the quest had been his anchor in a life of sterile duty. And now, it was over. Thank you, she said, the words simple, but imbued with the weight of her entire being. She rose from her chair and did something that shocked them both. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he did not pull away. You have given me back myself. In that quiet, shared moment, the space between them changed. It was no longer the vast gulf between a duke and a commoner, a savior and a victim. It was the space between two people who had both been shaped by the ghosts of the past, who had finally found a safe harbor in the truth. A first, fragile thread of understanding was woven between them, a connection that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with a shared, profound humanity. The future was a blank page, but for the first time in her life, Eleonora felt she had the strength to write her own story upon it. A year passed. It was a year of profound and dizzying transformation. With the Duke's quiet, unwavering support, Eleonora claimed her name and her inheritance. The legal battles were swift and decisive, his power a silent, irresistible force that swept all obstacles from her path. Society, once so quick to scorn her, now formed over the romantic, tragic story of the lost Marchioness's daughter. Lady Beatrice and her ilk offered saccharine apologies, which Eleonora accepted with a cool grace that Alaric had taught her. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was Lady Eleonora Thorne, a woman of substance and standing. She took possession of Clarewood Manor, the sun-drenched home of her earliest memories. It had fallen into some disrepair, but she poured her energy into restoring it, finding a deep satisfaction in bringing beauty back to a place that had been neglected. But she did not live there. She could not. Her home was now Alveston House. Her relationship with Alaric had evolved slowly, cautiously. The formal titles and stilted conversations gave way to shared meals, quiet evenings in the library, and long walks in the garden. She learnt the man behind the ducal mask. She discovered his dry, subtle wit, his passion for ancient history, and the profound loneliness he had carried for so long. He, in turn, learned her. He would sit for hours, watching her sketch, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, and the kindness that had not been extinguished by years of hardship. He proposed to her on a rainy afternoon in the library, the place where she had learned the truth of her past. There was no grand declaration, no kneeling. He simply took her hand as they stood by the fire, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I find," he had said, his voice a low, serious rumble, "that the house is unbearably silent when you are not in it. I believe it would be a great inconvenience to me if you were ever to leave." He paused, his gaze intense. "Eleonora, will you marry me?" She had smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "It would be my great pleasure, Alaric, to be a permanent inconvenience." Now, on the first anniversary of the night he found her, she stood on her old balcony overlooking the gardens of Alverstone House. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Below, Alaric was talking to the head gardener, his posture relaxed, his face turned to the sun. He laughed at something the gardener said, a full, genuine sound that carried on the breeze. It was a sound she had come to cherish, a sound that had filled the once silent halls of his home and his heart. She had her sketchbook in her hands, the pages filled with the life they were building together. There were drawings of the restored rooms at Clarewood, of the sea from a trip they had taken to the coast, and dozens of sketches of Alaric. Alaric reading, Alaric riding, Alaric sleeping in a chair by the fire. He looked up then, as if sensing her gaze, and his eyes met hers across the distance. The smile he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated affection, a private language that belonged only to them. He was no longer the cold, unreadable Duke. He was simply her husband, her Alaric. She had fainted in the street, a girl with nothing but a stolen book of flowers and a history she did not know. She had woken up in a duke's house, a prisoner of his mysterious kindness. He had looked at her like he had been waiting, and she had not known that he had been waiting his entire life. He had been waiting for a promise to be fulfilled, for a ghost to be laid to rest, for a woman who could see the man he was and fill his empty world with light. True freedom, she had learned, was not about escaping a gilded cage. It was about finding the one person who gave you a reason to stay. A person's worth was not in their name or their station, but in the strength of their heart. And love, she now knew, was not always a sudden fire. Sometimes it was a quiet, patient thing, a steady hand that reached out in the darkness and gently, finally, guided you home.